Hello there, and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name is Jim Hustwit, and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I seek to understand the people and the process behind the best music in TV, film and games. I'm talking to composers, but I'm also talking to editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. This week, I'm talking to Jed Kurzel. Jed originally started out as the singer and frontman of the blues rock duo The Messel before turning his attention to composing for film. He won the Screen Music Awards Film Score of the Year for his debut film Snowtown. The film, which gained international recognition, explores the relationships between the murderous gang members behind a spate of killings in Adelaide, in Australia in the 1990s. Jed has since gone on to score feature films such as The Pope's Exorcist, The Babadook, Slow West and Macbeth, to name but a few. Jed, thanks for joining me.
Hi.
First question I always ask every guest is, if we were to rewind back to young Jed, growing up on the main streets of Australia, maybe around 10, if someone had asked you, what would you like to be when you grow up, what would you have replied?
I think it probably would have been either a professional tennis player. It would have been all sport, I think, back then. Professional tennis player or Australian rules footballer. That would have been it. Maybe playing music, but at that stage, not so much.
And presumably this is because you consumed a lot of sport and were...
Well, kind of. I mean, I played heaps of tennis, yeah, a lot of tennis, and that was pretty much all I did around that time. So that's sort of where it was all leading. But I kind of, entered into my teenage years and started seeing things a little differently. And then I think that was sort of where I mean, music had always been around and around the house. There were a lot of instruments around the house that we'd always have a go at. But and I was learning the flute, piano. You know, there was guitars around, so I'd always pick those up. So at a young age, but so it was kind of like music was just there. But in terms of what I was mostly spending my time doing was playing tennis.
And did you ever consider that tennis could be a professional route? Were you ever encouraged to pursue that?
I was, yeah, definitely. And definitely. I mean, I played every day, practiced every day, and that's where the kind of trajectory was going. I was doing really well, and that's sort of what I thought I was going to do, but, I was still really young, so I hadn't, there's a difference between being kind of hemmed in with a particular thing and then eventually your worldview widens, or just the world gets bigger and you suddenly discover other things. But, I think music was always there. It just took a little while for it to kind of come to the fore, and I think also too, there's a point where you kind of think, oh, I can't do this. Maybe I'm not really that good at it, or I won't be any good at it, or how do you do this? That kind of thing. So once I got rid of that, I was sort of on my way. And
was the first foray into music, obviously you were learning instruments, but was the first foray as a singer-songwriter?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I could, it's interesting, as soon as I could put some chords together on a guitar, I wasn't really that interested in learning other people's songs. I actually just started immediately writing my own, which were absolutely atrocious. But but that was my kind of way in, and it was all very intuitive from that point, and it still is today, I think.
Yeah.
I think, it's interesting because I started off as a singer-songwriter as well, and actually, weirdly, just before Christmas, I decided to listen back to my back catalogue, and it's not something that I ever talk about or advertise or encourage people to do. But at the same time, do you know what, listening back, 15, 20 years later, it was interesting listening with different ears, and obviously I would do things very differently now. But there was some okay stuff in there, and I can see how it was an important, integral part of where I've sort of come today. I
bet there's like a core. I don't know. There's a musical identity in there that's probably still, you could probably still hear today.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'd like to think it's evolved a bit, or maybe completely changed.
Well, you know what I mean. It's like, it's some things in there that you go, in amongst it, there's something I still hear now.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because we'll touch on this later, but we're very much formed and shaped by the music that we, or not even just music, but art that we consume, and that all feeds into what we create. But that idea of having a sound, it's obviously very hard for you as a creative to be able to hear it. Other people might be able to hear it. Do you feel that, particularly in the early days of like the mess hall, or when you were writing your own songs, can you listen back now to that and hear an identity?
Yeah, I can hear. I can hear it. I can hear it in most things. It's quite funny. My brother, his daughter's 16, 17, and they're making a short film, or they're trying to make a short film at the moment. But they were messing around with music for it, and they both play the guitar. And he sent me something that they'd done, and it was really funny because it was like in the essence of it, it almost sounded like something I would have done, which I thought was really interesting. And he sent it to me, and he said, "Oh, have a listen to this." And I said to him, "That's weirdly sounds like something that I would have come up with a while back, or when I was that age." Brilliant. And he said, "That's exactly why I sent it to you, because I felt the same way." So it's a weird kind of thing, whether, I don't know, it's kind of filtered in through them, but. I think I kind of know. I know it in certain things when I hear it, But in some scores, I can hear it more than others. But I do have moments where someone says, "Oh, that sounds like you," and I'm kind of go, I sort of know, but I kind of don't as well. I know the process, but it's just the what part of the outcome sounds like me.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, enjoyed success with the mess hall, doing the singer-songwriter thing. How long did that go on for, and at what point did you decide to switch your attention to composing for film?
It all happened really kind of naturally in some respect. I'd been touring around quite a bit, and I just kind of wanted to stay home and my brother had made a film, or was making a film, his first film, because he'd been to a film school, and then he asked me if I'd be interested in doing some music for it, and I said, well, I haven't done that before, and I don't, this could go horribly wrong, and then you're going to be stuck in a really terrible situation. But he sort of said, no, I think you could do it, and let's just have a go, and if it doesn't work, then that's fine, at least we can be honest with each other. And so that's sort of what happened. It was really nice. I got to sort of sit at home and make music for a while, and not go out and be away. I just had a kid by that stage as well, and it just worked out. I kind of finished it. Didn't really know what I was doing, but kind of did. It was, and we'll go and talk about that later. But I think because the film, I identified pretty clearly with the film, because it was a film that was set in an area close to an area that I grew up on. So I knew the kind of landscape and the place and the people a bit more. So I'm sure that filtered into everything. And so it kind of happened by accident, really. Not accident, sort of not. Also prior to this, I had been kind of making lots of music on my own at home. That wasn't singer-songwriter orientated at all. It was more kind of, it was more composer kind of stuff. And my brother had commented before that it sounded very filmic. So I think that's probably why he approached me.
And had you always enjoyed watching film? Is that perhaps where the So that was naturally filtering through into some of the music you're making.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we were both really, really keen on film, and we lived in the country, and then we moved to the city in Adelaide in South Australia. And there was a video store right on the corner of the street that we moved into, and it was a really, really good one too. Like it had it had an amazing sci-fi section and an amazing art house section, amazing foreign film section, which in those days, that's the only way you could really go and see those films. So we would just devour everything in there and go and get 10 videos, come back, and we'd finish them within a couple of days. So that was sort of our first sort of foray into, our first interest in films was that video store. And, I guess you find a director that you like and you start looking for other films that they've done. And, so I guess that was our first education. Yeah.
And it was such a beautiful experience as well, wasn't it? Going down to the video store, you'd be in there for sometimes up to an hour trying to choose which film you want to get out. And
amazing.
Have you ever tried to explain to your children the concept of rewinding a film?
I haven't. I've forgotten about the idea of rewinding a film, and then also too those video stores that would check.
Yeah, and they sometimes fine you next time you go back. They're sort of like, "Oh, you owe us an extra £2 because you didn't rewind it." Like, what? Yeah, militant. And just going back to that idea that so even before you've obviously been touring, you've been making music, but then before you've even done a film, you're making music for yourself. What did you get out of that? What was driving you to just make music was it just a pure passion just for the fun of it? Or
yeah, that's all it was. I mean, I love I'm a curious person by nature, and also I do love sitting around and just creating stuff, at that stage, whether it was music or anything else. So and I really like the solitude in that as well, just kind of hunkering down and just creating your own worlds and doing that through music. I love that. So I was happy to do that all day, and for no reason. It had no outcome or anything. It was just because I really enjoyed doing it. I'd probably do that for the rest of my life. If I wasn't doing this, I'd still be making music. So.
Yeah. There was, I think, with interviewing Michael Price and another guy, Dan Mulhern, and maybe some others, but they often talk about that just flow state. You just sort of disappear inside this creative process, that everything else seems to sort of just fade into the background and you kind of lose yourself in it. And there's something quite meditative about that. And
yeah, I think so. And I think also the really important thing to consider in all of that is that it's one of the very few times when you're truly living in the present as well. And so that to me is a really important, I think that's the kind of ultimate space you want to be creatively, but just in terms of, I guess, even if you're meditating or something like that. So I think being able to put yourself in that place and doing it through creating music or anything else is really valuable.
And do you manage to carry that sense of being very present in the moment outside of the music into day-to-day life?
Not so much. I find myself either side. So but I find that I mean, you'd have this too, where if you pick up an instrument and start playing it, you immediately are just there with it in that moment. So I think if I want to find that state, I'll probably do that most of the time. It's just sit there and play it.
Yeah. It's funny. I was listening to. I'm always fascinated by creativity, and I was listening to, I think it was Big Magic with Elizabeth Gilbert, and she was talking about the idea that when we're children, we're very good at sort of just sitting down and drawing, and some kids obviously more predisposed to it than others, but that's all part of, again, this idea of just being sort of present and in the moment. And then as we get older, we end up looking for that feeling, but through other things. So quite often we turn to alcohol or girls or the opposite sex, and actually lose touch with that creativity, and that there's sort of more and more people are increasingly sort of looking back to arts and crafts. I did a course a couple of years ago which was intuitive art. I've never done pastels and things like that, but it was in that, and I had exactly the same with that. And actually it's something that children instinctively turn to, or even just play, imaginative play, but then you sort of drift away from through your teens and into your adult life. But there's definitely merit in rediscovering it.
I think other things kind of catch up with you as well, and it's hard to stay in the moment. But yeah, music is one of those things. I see it with my kids as well. With them growing up, was just sit there and watch them do something, and they're nowhere else but right in that space. It's it's amazing.
Do you feel that there was a kind of like a milestone or a seminal moment or a turning point in doing what you were doing when momentum started to pick up and things started to happen?
It was after that film. This was Snowtown. Once that went out, it was. I thought I was going to do it, and then that was it. Like, I just go back to what I was doing, and this was just a sort of, another place that I was going to go. I've always been like that, where I'll try different things, and I'm, where they end up, it sort of didn't really ever matter to me. But this seemed to gain traction, and I suddenly was offered other things and was winning awards and stuff. So, and it went. I think the biggest thing too is that film kind of went international. And in Australia, back then, this was 2010. That's quite a difficult thing to do, to be recognised outside of this country, because we're so far away. So that changed. That one changed a lot of things, because I was kind of getting offers of different things, not just film, but other things that weren't just in Australia. It was outside.
Well, that provides a perfect segue into Snowtown and going under the skin. Under the skin. So, at what point in the process did you start writing music? Was it a case of reading the script and coming up with ideas, or did you have some visuals to work with? What was the process there? I went
on set for a couple of days, just because I was in that city visiting my mother. So I went on set for a couple of days and kind of reacquainted myself with the landscape, particularly, and driving through that area. And I'm a real believer that if you just let things come in, whether you want them to have any sort of impact or not, I think they eventually will, or certain things will. You've just got to go out there and sort of fill the well, and that's sort of what I was doing. And then I had a little room in just near King's Cross in Sydney, and I just sat in there daily and went in and just made music. And I was given initially just some bits and pieces of the film, and I was just making music, using that as an inspiration, and then the cuts sort of started coming in, but or little scenes that Justin would say, I'd need something here, I need something there. So so what eventually really happened was that there was one piece of music I had. So it was like 6 weeks into the editing. I think they only had another couple of weeks, and the film had a very different beginning to what it has now. And I remember sort of seeing that cut that they had and saying to Justin that I think the opening could be more dynamic. Like, we could do something more with this. And then he came in and said, well, what have you got? Like, what have you been doing lately? And he came in and listened to this piece of music. And from that, he re-edited the whole beginning with this piece of music. And that informed the entire film and made a real difference to things. And it sort of in some ways brought the stuff that I'd been doing together as well. And gave everything, that gave the music a through line and a sort of narrative as well. So as I said, it was sort of one of those things where it came kind of late, but it was really effective in the end.
And did Justin come to you with quite a detailed brief, or was it fairly open, just do your thing?
It was pretty open, yeah. It was just kind of react to the film. He had definitely not used any other influences in the making of it either, like, because he was sort of saying the influence is coming from that environment and the people we're working with. So I kind of went with that as well. And my kind of idea about it was that, because it's such a horrific story, that the music was almost coming out of the landscape and the walls, and there was almost like the music kind of felt like some sort of curse. Yeah, so that's sort of what we were going with. But yeah, I mean, I didn't expect it to have the, I guess, impact and reach that it did in the end.
And for anyone who hasn't seen the film, can you give us a brief synopsis of it?
I mean, it's based on probably one of the worst serial killing incidents in Australia, where a man went into a town, a small sort of town just out on the outskirts of the city, and basically got friendly with everyone and became almost like a kind of, a sort of guru leadership figure, not really a guru, but a leadership figure for this town that was, had a lot of problems, a lot of social problems, and it wasn't hard for him to get everyone's trust. And he ended up murdering a lot of people and bringing quite a few others in the community into those murders as well. And eventually he was caught because he'd been dumping these bodies, putting them in barrels and storing them in a bank vault in a place called Snowtown, which the police eventually found. But I mean, the story is basically he became a father figure for this one character, Jamie, this teenage boy, and subsequently this boy ended up being involved in a lot of these killings, whether he liked it or not. So it's a very full-on story and a confronting film. So doing the music for it was it was kind of unlike anything I've done, because you couldn't comment. So if you did something too far on one side and it felt like you were commenting, it was trash. And then if you did too little, it was kind of like, well, what's the point? So there was a definite kind of, I don't know, it was a very sensitive way of kind of getting music into this film. So,
and did that evolve through just trial and error?
It did, because when I do things that were just like, oh, that's too much, and I don't want to say, and I don't want to come in here and go, and this is what we think, or the filmmaker doesn't want to do that either. It's you just kind of, it was very intuitive. You just knew when something sat in the film in a I guess a tasteful way, and wasn't just wasn't, I guess, behaving in that way that a lot of film scores behave, where they're adding another layer of narrative or something like that.
When you first started working on it, did you have a clear idea of instrumentation and soundscape, or was that something that evolved as well?
No, I mean, I was kind of hemmed in with budget because I didn't have a lot to work with. So, anything like strings or anything like that were out. So, I mean, in the end, I did everything myself. I played everything myself and recorded it all myself. But that's sort of all I knew anyway. So, and I think I had a really lot of lucky mistakes that I made, particularly there's one element of that soundtrack which is really important to the film, and it's this kind of throbbing, pulsing sound that was a kind of accident. And I'd left a guitar going through like a Memory Man pedal, and I had it up full, and I just went off and had some lunch, and I came back, and it was just still going. The delay was still going, but it lost. By that stage, which must have been an hour and a half, 2 hours later, it had lost all semblance of what it was, or if there was an instrument there. And it was just this amazing kind of sound. And then I got in there and just started moving a lot of the dials on the pedal and kind of played it in the end, and sort of recorded and played it. So it was that became a really important part of the score. But yeah, it was a complete and utter accident, and I can remember walking in the room going, that sounds cool.
And is because I was talking to Christabel Tapia de Veer, and he's very much about, as much as it is about harmony, for him it's very much about sonic textures and creating unusual sounds. It sounds like that might be a little bit a part of your process as well. I will also listening to your scores. I think there's definitely an element of that.
It is, yeah, it is. I mean, like, I think it becomes a part of, I mean, with him, it's like a very identifiable thing that he does, which is fantastic. In that you're always kind of listening, going, he's taken something and turned it into that, or it's something that he did that was, again, like a mistake that just became a really, really strong motif. That kind of stuff I'm always looking for. I think also too in a world that we're getting to with lots and lots of sample libraries around, and outside of the orchestral ones, which are, I guess they are useful for demoing bigger films and that kind of stuff. But the other ones, I don't know, I just tend to steer clear of, because I kind of feel like I kind of hear everyone just using the same sort of things. So I think steering clear of those and kind of making your own sounds is a better way of going about it, because in the end you finish something and go, well, that couldn't have existed unless I came up with it, which I think is really, really important. I mean, it's a lot more work, because you can sit there for a whole day making one little sound, but when you get it, it's I guess it's what Christabel was saying, is that you only need like 3 or 4 or 5 really original sounds that you can put together, and they all could be played on their own and be really fantastic. And if you find 3 or 4 of them that work really well together, then that's exciting. They can sound bigger than any orchestra.
Interesting as well when you're saying, obviously, that first film project, you're doing pretty much everything yourself. A huge part of this is the trial and error of creating these unique sounds and textures and things. How do you balance that idea of keeping that the sort of the Jed Kurzel sound, but also then bringing in other people to sort of help out?
I think, it's a good question. I mean, that that can be really difficult, but I think maybe it is within the core of what you're doing. You're creating things that everything else that's going to kind of bounce off of in some ways, or something's just going to grow out of that initial idea. So in the end, you might have orchestras around it and everything else, but it's still sort of that initial idea is still in there. Or it's kind of like, I mean, Macbeth was a really good example of that, where we're using strings, but it was definitely going, well, we want to always use them in a really interesting way, so that this is the way the piece is written, and you could play it like this on the piano, you could play it like this on the guitar or whatever, but we get into a room with the players, and it's like, okay, well, how do we approach this in a different way? So that can be really exciting as well. I mean, I really love that process as well, because it's nice to suddenly for things to get collaborative and things get done a lot quicker as well. And with you're less inclined to kind of overthink as well. It's kind of like, oh, that sounds great, let's move on.
It's funny you should mention Macbeth as well, actually, because that score stands out hugely in my mind, because, as you say, you've got the violin. There's quite a lot of what sounds like solo violin, or a smaller section, but the way it's recorded, there's a real grainy grittiness. You can hear the bow, which feels really uncomfortable, particularly given the sort of heavy nature of the play as well. Was that something that was deliberate, like sort of close miking or compressing the hell out of the mics to make sure you got that?
Yeah, it was really deliberate. It was kind of like constantly, that sounds too nice, so let's try and make it sound uglier, or there's also too, I mean, a big thing about that was that even though it sort of sounds like a decent sized score, I think it was only really in the end 15 players, and the great thing about that was that you could mic it in a certain way that you heard everyone individually in the end, and I really liked that sound for that film. it was just everything was in there. It was like all the graininess and all the kind of dirt was in there, and the film kind of really enjoyed it too. But it was hard getting that idea through to producers and everyone else. But we did in the end, and in the end, they really loved it. So.
Well, interesting question to ask you as well, because I was talking to Hannah Peel about this, and the idea that a lot of people, directors, producers will say, oh yeah, we want something new and edgy that we've not heard before, but at the same time are quite often restricted by what they know and what they're familiar with. So as someone who's sort of looking to try and push those boundaries, how do you navigate that world whereby I'm doing something a little bit like with Macbeth, sort of particularly grainy, gritty strings, and sort of push that through, but then at the same time people are going, oh, I don't know, we've not really heard that before and it sounds a bit like, how do you because obviously you don't want it's a collaboration, but at the same time you don't want to compromise on your creative integrity, and if you feel it's what you're being asked to do is doing so, then how do you tread that line?
I think it's kind of, you have a kind of belief in what the idea is that you're going for, and I think you just kind of stick with it and until someone really says no, that's not. But I think gaining everyone's trust. But I think along the way as well, you're throwing out crumbs of what it's going to be, and I think if you can kind of get people excited along the way without having to give them the full thing, just kind of keep them going, then you'll eventually kind of get there. I mean, I've had it on a few films. I mean, even on Alien Covenant, there was an idea that I had on there that, that got a lot of pushback, and it was quite a big one. It could have been an incredibly expensive mistake. and kind of I got it through in the end as well. But yeah, it was all pretty nerve-wracking kind of leading up to it and going, I don't know if this is going to work or whether this was the right idea. But I think usually if you have a belief that it's going to work, you'll make it work.
Well, I suppose as you become more established, people are coming to you for a particular sound. They know what you do, and presumably they want you to do what they know you to do. So it's maybe a tougher sell at the beginning, but as you get more well known and have the body of work behind you, it's maybe a bit easier to sell.
I think it is, but you do still kind of go through moments where you can just feel everyone's not sure with what you're doing. I mean, that's the other thing too, is a lot of the times you're kind of halfway through and you can hear it all in your head. I mean, I always get to this stage where it's almost like you have a day where you have a real breakthrough and you can kind of hear it all in your head and you go, oh, it's kind of, in some ways in your head you think it's done. Like, I've finished it. And that's sort of when the hard work really begins, because you've got to then put it all together. I think there's a particular stage with every film where you sort of think that everyone else can hear it, hear what you're hearing in your head, but they, obviously they can't.
Well, that's interesting, because chatting with Michael Price, so he was saying that he used to, when he was submitting demos, he used to go really far down the rabbit hole to make sure the demos were as good as possible. But the problem was that if there was pushback and they didn't like them, it meant he'd wasted a lot of time getting them sounding amazing. How far do you go with the demo creation before you've had any feedback? And do you trust the people that you're giving it to be able to hear beyond that initial idea and like, here's a mock-up, but it will sound different?
That's an interesting question. I think with people you've already worked with, it's easier to come at them with demos that are a lot less finished than others. I think maybe with directors you're working with for the first time, that might be a little different. You might need to kind of. I'll tend to. I think the other thing too is, I get to a point where I think this is going to work. It's just I've got to sell it in some ways and make it sound really great to get it working, and then then it'll do its thing after that. I definitely feel like I know the ideas that I'm sending through that, like, I don't know, just get through, and I don't even know if I really like it. And for those ones, I probably won't give them as much love as others, for sure.
So would you, if you were working with a new director and you're submitting, or you're pitching, or you're submitting demos, would you ever submit something which just had VST strings, or would you always record the real deal?
No, I do it with the demo strings. Yeah. Cool. And then kind of, there'd be but a lot of the times I've gotten to a point where I'm able to do a sort of a mixture, so you get an idea of kind of what it is. But I think the thing is too is that if those kind of things sound too polished, then it can put you in a bit of a trap at the end where live sort of sounds like a whole different thing. And then you start getting all the nuance playing and a lot of that, and that's suddenly something you got to sell again, or just kind of not sell so much, but you're sort of going, no, this was what it was in my head was going to sound like. So
yeah, there's the danger. It's the same with the temp track, isn't it? The idea that if people hear something enough, anything that strays from that isn't ever quite right. So managing.
Which is kind of a similar thing with temp music, I guess. Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed there's a sort of I asked Christabel the same question, but I noticed that with your credits, it's obviously fairly horror oriented. I mean, it sounds like Snowtown was pretty not horror, but it was pretty intense and pretty dark. And then you've got the Babadook, you've got the Exorcist, the Pope's Exorcist. Do you enjoy making people feel uncomfortable? I guess I don't know. I think, I don't know, I feel like I know what sounds uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think that's, yeah, I don't know what that is. I mean, I kind of have an ear for things where I think that is a really uncomfortable sound, and it might be something that's really mundane to someone else, but maybe put together with some other things you could kind of highlight it a little. But, yeah, I think so. I mean, I really liked. I think I've told this story before, but when I was a kid in Australia, we had this TV station called SBS, which is just it's all the content is from all countries outside of Australia. So it's basically for anyone new to the country or migrants to go, well, I want to watch Polish news, it's on at 3:30 to 4:30 on this television. If I want to watch the Japanese news, it's on. So everyone can kind of get a bit of get their own news, culture, whatever. But at nights, they would always have films, and they'd just be from everywhere. So, and I remember one week they had the whole week was a special on giallo films, the Italian 70s horror films, and I had no idea what the hell this was, because it was kind of like I just flicked the TV on one night, and what came on was Who Saw Her Die, which was a Morricone score, and I immediately was like, and I was a kid, just what is that? And it was one of those kind of moments where it jumped out at me, and I subsequently watched a lot of these films throughout the week, not really understanding them or anything, but they all had really unnerving scores, and they were unlike anything I'd heard or what challenged my notion of what music was, and later on what film music was. And that sort of never left me, and maybe that played a bit of a part in it, because they weren't, a lot of them weren't so much horror in that traditional sense. They did their horror in a quieter way, but to me it was way more effective.
Were you as conscious of the film score when you were watching English films, or was the fact that these Italian films you couldn't really follow the dialogue and the narrative so much, so you were more attuned to the score?
Yeah, it was that, and I think also too the way they were shot and just the performances and everything felt really different to what I knew of English films, American films. Australian films at that stage had a really interesting thing going on as well. They were unnerving. I mean, they always kind of have been unnerving, and if they've moved on into that area, horror films or thrillers or anything like that. So, but these Italian films were very much like, I don't particularly. I felt like I really landed on another planet, and I was And I was trying to decipher a new language, and that was language, not just language, but in terms of film language and the way things were shot, the way the sound was handled and all those kind of things.
Getting a taste. I always think, you mentioned it before, that we're very much... there's a certain period of our life, maybe from 10 to mid-20s or whatever, where the art, the film, the films, the music that we consume goes some way to informing, if you're a creative, how you create. Are there some like specific seminal albums, bands that stick out in your mind as when you sort of heard them? It was a sort of epiphany moment. It sounds like these Italian films were certainly provided that. But what about musically? Was there anything?
Musically, I remember a big turning point for me was, I think I must have been about 12 or 13, and I heard the Velvet Underground for the first time. That was quite a big deal. I remember. I just remember that as like, whoa. And I think maybe that it's just one of those things that it either happens to just people or it doesn't with particular bands. But that one, I know, has had an effect on a lot of people in terms of that album, that first album. But that particularly, again, was like, I don't know what this is, but I'm strangely attracted to it and want to listen to it again, I can still listen to that album, and I find it as fresh now as it was then, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, that was a big one, and again the Giallo scores were a massive thing in terms of discovering how another way that music could be made or be another way it can be approached.
Are there, even now, I mean, are there certain composers or certain film scores, from way back when, or even more recent, that you've heard and sort of just made you go, whoop? There's been that moment where you've gone, oh, hang on, that's interesting. What's that?
What did I hear? I heard the Gallipoli soundtrack again recently. Have you seen that film? The Peter Weir film, the World War One film. That's pretty amazing. Actually, his films have always got really great soundtracks. That's wild, that film. It's like it's an electronic soundtrack over a World War One film, and you just don't question it at all.
Right, that's well done then, because there's a weird sort of disconnect there, isn't there, between sort of synth sounds that didn't exist at the period during the time period that you're watching. Yeah,
and I mean, and these synth sounds, which now are kind of almost quite cheesy, they sit so well in really dramatic scenes as well. And it's just like they're over scenes that, I mean, if you showed them to anyone, those scenes, to any other composer, I think the last thing they would think about putting on there was like a kind of synth that someone's put on hold and just let it go. There was a sound in a beta band song that I heard that was, they definitely must have used some setting that the Gallipoli composer used. That's that setting, although I'm knowing Johnny might have even sampled it, so I don't know.
I suppose this was the thing in the 80s. If you were an early adopter of these synthesizers, you could get away with just using the sort of patches on them, and because no one had heard the sounds before. Whereas obviously then later iterations of it, like, hang on a minute, that sounds very familiar.
But Peter Weir was like that. I mean, like Picnic at Hanging Rock had those pan pipes. It's like the Australian bush, and you've got pan pipes going.
Yeah. Well, Enya used the pan pipes a lot, didn't she?
But I kind of always really, I've always really loved that when I see a film that I go, that's a really odd choice. And I kind of think about the conversation that must have happened. That was just like, yeah, we're going for it, or no, that sounds perfect. Let's do that, or yeah, whether there was any risk involved at all, that was just like, no, it's cool.
I think it's always, the tendency is to always go, oh, that was a weird choice. But then it's like, well, it might not necessarily have been the composer's first choice. It may have been execs pushing really hard on a particular sound. You sort of go, okay, well, I'll go easy. What was it? been through a period of revisiting old 80s action movies and watched revisited Young Guns. And that's interesting as well, because obviously we're sort of like in the American Wild West, but it was made in the 80s and somebody was really keen, I can't remember which composer it was, but was really keen to get his synths in there. So you've got sort of somebody herring down an 1800s street with a sort of dig, sort of like 80s synth going in the background. There's obviously guitars as well, and the guitars, even though, you know, they wouldn't have had amps and electric guitars, they feel slightly less incongruous than the sort of like...
So they've got a slightly Western feel.
Yeah, there's that sort of, you can get away with it. And I think, Bon Jovi did, it was Blaze of Glory was like on the soundtrack for Young Guns 2. So guitars feel right because even if they were acoustic, but yeah.
But someone's kind of gone, let's put the Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack over the...
Yeah, exactly. Let's get some arpeggiated synths going on this as well. It'll totally work. And no one's dared to sort of go, not so sure. But it makes for interesting listening if nothing else. And what about, are there, you mentioned these, the sort of Italian films, but are there specific films that you remember from your childhood that you saw that were sort of show-stopping moments?
Yeah. Actually, Gallipoli was one. Jaws was obviously for everyone was that was a big deal. And then moving through when we started, devouring the video store, I remember the first time I saw Raging Bull was kind of like that's pretty extraordinary. I remember we kind of went through Woody Allen's films for a bit, and it was that was kind of like I don't. Even as a young kid, I was like I don't quite understand it, but they're kind of interesting. And then the Kieslowski films were really amazing. And then I remember the 90s had that whole period where Reservoir Dogs came out, but around that was kind of like Bad Lieutenant and Man Bites Dog and all of those sort of films. I kind of look back now and I go, that was a pretty amazing time for film as well. We sort of didn't really know it. Lots of independent film coming through. In terms of going back to the full childhood. The Exorcist, I remember making an impact.
Well, on the subject of The Exorcist, according to your bio, the director of The Exorcist described The Babadook as the most terrifying film I'd ever seen.
She was actually that was actually a really fun film to work on. Even though the film was kind of crazy, but that was a good film to work on. She's fantastic.
Yeah,
Jen. She's a wonderful director and a great person.
Obviously, that relationship between director and composer is pretty important, and the better that relationship is, the generally more smooth flowing the process is. Do you get to a point where you would potentially say no to a project if you felt it wasn't right, or if the relationship wasn't there, or?
I think so. If I just didn't feel like, if I felt like it just wasn't something that I wanted to do. That's in the end, because they're quite. They're time consuming and they're kind of stressful. Those bigger films are with a lot of music, and not that that's such a bad thing, but you kind of want to really do them if you're going to go down that path. So, and sometimes you kind of meet people and you just and you both sort of feel it.
When you started out, did you take on any projects which, looking back, you sort of go, "Oh, I wish I hadn't done that"?
Oh yeah, there's a couple here and there. No, I won't mention what they are, but I don't know anyone who hasn't done projects that they kind of. That's the other thing too, is that you can take things on and think this is going to be amazing, and then halfway through, it just happens to everyone. Whether it's an actor or a composer, and it's like, I shouldn't have been doing this, or someone else should have done it, or the project's just gone off the ball. And
yeah, it was funny because I'm not going to say the person's name, but we were talking about a project, and during the podcast interview, it sounded like a fantastic project, and they'd really enjoyed doing it. And then once we'd finished recording, got off air, and started to tell me a little bit more about how it had gone down, and it sounded like an absolute nightmare, and they would never ever do it again. It's like, but it's the classic press junket thing, isn't it? The actors have got to go out there on screen and go, yeah, I really felt connected with this character, and the director was great, and the script was amazing, when deep down they're thinking, no, it's a piece of shit, I wish I'd never done it.
Yeah. And I mean, there are absolute horror stories from composers have some of the best.
Well, and as well, I think something that a lot of people don't realise is that it's because it's obviously not necessarily talked about very much, but composers do get fired from jobs. Stephen Warbeck was quite open talking about projects that he's been fired on, and not because of any major problems. It's just somehow there's a breakdown in communication, or what the director or the production team are asking for, they're not able to deliver. Because then afterwards, when you sort of see the final product, you sort of think, well, I could totally have done that, but at some point there was just a breakdown in communication as to what was actually required.
Yeah, or it just becomes, I mean, other times too, the film can become a different thing than what it was before it was shot. And they, it gets in the edit and it might not be working, and it's sort of shoved into a new direction, or just isn't what, which I think is kind of interesting too, is that a film in an edit just starts speaking and it'll tell you what it wants to be. And a lot of those preconceived ideas may just be wrong, and I think if you sometimes people try and hang on to those where the film's going, just let it go. It needs to be this, and you have to run now in this direction, which is a hard thing, because a lot of the times the people making films, or directors, producers, they've been living with these things for sometimes 10 years. So it's like in there they've got the whole thing in their head, and it's got to be like this. And the hardest thing is to throughout the creative process be open to it shifting.
Yeah, sure. And have you had similar experiences with cues whereby you've been flogging a dead horse, and at some point you've got to go, look, this just isn't working, go back to the drawing board and start from scratch?
I think so. I think as I've gotten more experience, I can start to tell when that's happening, when it's just like, well, I've now been working on this one cue for 3 days. I think that's saying something, obviously, because I've always found that the better ones, the better stuff tends to come really quickly. And that's not to say that it comes quickly and that it was just like, bang, I just wrote it. It's more that there's a lot of preparation that goes into getting yourself to that point of writing it that quickly. But yeah, it feels like the good stuff tends to kind of appear, whereas that stuff that you're really hammering away at.
So they just got to let it go.
Well, you might send that in with the one that you did quickly too, and it's just immediately they go, what's this one? I don't know about that one, but
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because sometimes you can... I have it sometimes when I'm pitching for, it's usually sort of advertising stuff, where I'll do 3 tracks and there's 2 which I think are really good and 1 which is really shit. But then I sort of think, well, I think it's shit, but let them decide it's shit. At least there's 2 others to sort of balance it out. And then invariably they come back and want the shit one. So it's like, okay, well, it's allowing somebody else to make that decision for you, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's a tricky thing. It's like sending in the shit one. It's always
It's like, is this undermining everything?
If it gets chosen, I'm in a hell of a lot of trouble.
Amazing. Well, I think it's probably a good time to wrap up, Jed. Thanks very much for taking the time to chat. I do have a couple of quick-fire questions, which I always like to finish with. The first one is, what's your favourite biscuit?
I'm Australian, so Tim Tams.
Tim Tams. What's a Tim Tam for anyone who doesn't know a Tim Tam?
A Tim Tam is a chocolate biscuit that has a chocolate coating on the outside, and then the kind of crumbly biscuit, and then another soft inside bit. But you eat it here by cutting one corner off one end, another corner off the other end, and you put it in a cup of tea and suck the guts of it out.
Nice. It's so funny. Everyone has a unique way of eating the biscuit. Like Hannah Peel was talking about how she's got a very particular way of eating a Jaffa cake.
Oh, the Jaffa. Well, see, you know what? I was introduced to the Jaffa cakes when I lived over there in the UK, and Yeah, and I thought it was more of a biscuit.
But here is the conundrum, because this was it. Hannah posited it as a biscuit. But so technically, and I don't know what the science is on this, but if a biscuit, if you leave it out, goes soft, whereas cake, if you leave it out, it goes hard, and a Jaffa cake technically gets crispier as you leave it out. So does that not technically mean it is a cake? But this philosophers for millennia have been debating this, and it looks like a biscuit, so it is a biscuit. The next quickfire question: what's a little known fact about you?
A little known fact: I'm ambidextrous. I can kind of, I don't know if that's much of a superpower, because I actually find it more that it's just confusing. It's not like I can do things both hands. It's more that sometimes I have to really make a choice as to which hand.
So how does that play out then? If you're ambidextrous, can you?
If I pick out some scissors, a pair of scissors, I'll kind of have a moment of.
Would you be able to play guitar left-handed?
No, but this is what's interesting thing is when I first picked it up in, I think I reckon I would have been 7 or 8, I picked it up left-handed, and that was the natural place, but I just couldn't play it, and so I put it away. And then when I picked it up a couple of years later, it went right. So right, yeah.
And
so,
it was easy.
Yeah, well, then I found it easier to learn. Yeah. Whereas the other way was just kind of like, something's wrong here. So, and my children do the same. So,
well, I suppose the strings would be upside down as well, wouldn't they, if you're playing a normal guitar left-handed?
Well, my youngest picked up the guitar and immediately went left-handed, but did the same thing that I would have done. Kind of went, maybe on this, but settled on left. And I was like, oh God, I've got to string everything up left-handed. So I just kind of grabbed it and flipped it to the right. So she plays right now, which is fine.
What scares you?
What scares me? Deadlines can be pretty scary. I'm not a huge fan of heights in terms in a traditional scary sense. I'd say
heights and deadlines.
Heights and deadlines.
Yeah. And finally, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh God, it's easy. Relax. It'll come. Go to bed.
Is that specifically music, or like within your life generally?
In life generally, but I think it really kind of came out with doing music. Yeah, I mean, composing for sure is that took a long time to get my head around. You can stay up all night flogging a dead horse. It'll come. That's the one. That's what I would say.
Trust the process.
Yes.
Well, Jed, thanks so much for taking time to chat. It's been fascinating hearing about your experiences and backstory. Do you social? Where can people find you?
No, I don't. I don't do any social media. I'm a kind of not that I even got off. I just never got on. and I've gotten this far without it. So it feels like everyone's jumping off it now. So.
Well, I got axed from Instagram for no apparent reason, other than there was apparently it was flagged for abuse, even because I never used it, I never did anything with it, but it was flagged for abuse. And then ultimately what they wanted was my facial profile in order for me to continue using it. And I was like, you don't need my facial profile. They were asking for a level of security beyond what PayPal asks. They needed my and I'm just like, no, I'm sorry. And then they just deleted my account permanently. So they did me a favour, I think, because it's a waste of time.
I'm glad, because it's also, I think as well that I know what I'm like, and I'd probably end up just doing social media all day, every day, and getting nothing done.
Well, okay, so basically Spotify, IMDb, if you want to... Spotify is probably the best place to go and have a listen to your stuff. It's great, so definitely recommend people do. Jed, thanks very much.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larpmusic.com. Larpmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.